we're going to continue our discussion on some of the new frontiers in medicine today. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce the speakers who are on stage with me. To my left, immediate left, we have Dr. Shannon Maud. She's an attending physician at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, also known as CHOP, and is an expert in immunotherapy. Next to her is Dr. Nirali Shah, an associate research physician in the pediatric oncology branch at the National Cancer Institute. She focuses on clinical trials with a specific focus also on immune-based therapies. We're also joined, I'm delighted to meet and to see Tom Whitehead, who's the co-founder of the Emily Whitehead Foundation. 5 years ago, his daughter, Emily, was the first child in the world to receive the groundbreaking immunotherapy that we have been talking about, the CAR T-cell therapy, and that we will be talking about some more. Her leukemia went into remission after being treated at CHOP, and Emily will be joining us on the stage a little bit later. So thank you all for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So Dr. Mott, I wonder if you could get us started and give us a little bit of background about how this clinical trial that Emily was treated in came to be.
Well, immunotherapy has been something that's been of interest to the cancer research field for many years, over 20 years. People have been studying ways to harness our immune system to be able to fight cancer. But it really wasn't until recent years, I would say the last 10 years or so, that has been able to advance enough to the point that therapies were potentially effective and something that could move into clinical trials to test the safety and to test the efficacy. So at Penn, Carl June had been working on immune-based therapies for cancer for many years, and he, along with David Porter at Penn, started a clinical trial in a different type of leukemia, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and treated 3 adults with a CD19 targeted immune therapy.
And CD19 is a protein that appears on the surface of
B-cell cancers. So there are different types of leukemias and lymphomas that arise from different cells in our immune system. In one broad field are B-cell malignancies, leukemias and lymphomas. CD19 is a protein that's very widely expressed on those types of cancers, and so it's something that is very attractive to be able to target so that the immune system can find the cancer. The principle behind this is that we take a part of the immune system, the T cell in particular, which is very good at killing diseases, things that shouldn't be in our body, and we teach it to be able to recognize the leukemia by recognizing that CD19.
And what does the HIV virus have to do with this?
So the HIV virus is something that has been exploited to be able to reprogram and teach these T cells how to recognize the leukemia. So what we're really doing is using a form of the HIV virus, or something called a lentivirus, and changing it in a way so that it's no longer HIV, but what we're doing is exploiting the ability of that virus to get into a T cell and to deliver a piece of DNA. So we're really using it as a delivery vehicle to change the T cells.
So as I understand it, Dr. June and Dr. Porter treated 3 adult patients. They had good results. They ran out of money. And so then they had to stop for a while. And then when they received more funding, then they were working with CHOP to open the pediatric trial. Is that the way it went, pretty much?
Well, Dr. June and Dr. Grupp at CHOP had been collaborating for many years to study these therapies, and there was definitely interest to be able to move this into pediatrics and into one form of pediatric leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. But in order to do that, we always have to first see that something can be safely given to adults and that there's some hint that it may work. And so that was what came out of those first groundbreaking studies in the 3 adults. And after those 3 adults were treated, then the first child was treated at CHOP.
So, Mr. Whitehead, Tom.
Hi.
Take us back to 2010 and as this was going on, the research was going on, you had a beautiful 5-year-old daughter who was healthy, and then she was not healthy, she was sick. What happened?
Yeah, literally overnight. It was Thursday, May 27th of 2010, and she was healthy. My wife had noticed that she had bruising on her legs, and we look back now, and she had some bleeding on her gums that week, and I had noticed blood on the end of her nose. But she felt normal until the day she was diagnosed. So overnight, she had severe leg pains, and by morning, we decided to take her to the pediatrician, and Carrie took her, my wife Carrie, and her mom Pam. And I had to go to work, but by 9 o'clock, they called me and said that Emily was in the emergency room and that there was really something wrong. And over that weekend, which was Memorial Day weekend, they diagnosed her with leukemia.
So you went initially to Hershey Medical Center, is that right?
Correct.
And she had the standard treatment, which is, as I understand it, 26 months of chemo?
Yeah, that's what we were told.
That's a pretty tough regimen to start with.
Yeah, and she had a tough start, but she did get into remission, and she stayed in remission for 16 months, the first 16 months. So in the beginning, we were told it's the garden variety kind of cancer, and if you have to have a child with cancer, this is the one you want to have, and it's the most curable. So we thought, we could get through this, and from the time Emily was diagnosed, I picked her up and looked her in the eye and said, no matter what happens, you're going to beat this because only the strongest kids in the world are picked to fight cancer. So it was pretty devastating 16 months in when we went for routine blood work. And Dr. Jim Powell at Hershey, he's at Mount Nittany Medical Center, but he's local to us. And he called me the next day and said, unfortunately, Emily's relapsed, and this almost never happens when chemotherapy is working for these kids.
Works for 80 or 90% of children, right?
Yeah.
So she was unfortunately in the group that it didn't work for. And then, as I understand, you went back and forth a little bit between CHOP and Hershey, and in any case, after a couple back and forths, you ended up back at CHOP because almost amazingly, the T-cell trial was opening up earlier than expected. And people were worried that Emily wasn't going to be able to wait for the opening of the trial.
Correct. We had been told once about the T-cell trial, but said Emily probably can't survive long enough for the FDA to give us approval to try it, so you don't wait for that. We tried to get her to bone marrow transplant, and we never met her donor, but the donor delayed us by 3 to 4 weeks and said they weren't available to donate cells. And halfway through that delay, she relapsed again. And finally, Hershey docs come in and said, unfortunately, we don't have any more weapons to fight her cancer. And when we paged Dr. Reingold and back at CHOP and said, we're coming no matter what, because we're not going home on hospice. And she said, this is amazing to me because the last email I read yesterday was that we got FDA approval to try the T-cell trial.
So at that point then, that's the spring of 2012, and now you're in Philadelphia, and they extracted her T-cells, and it took 6 weeks to genetically alter them?
Yeah, that's correct. She was in isolation in her hospital room with no immune system for 6 weeks while they told them we're going to send them off to boot camp and we're going to train them to be an Army, and when they come back in there, they're going to go in there and kill your cancer.
And what happened when she started getting the treatment?
So the first 2 days she did good, and they explained to us, and she was patient 1 in a phase 1 trial, that you split up the dose 10% the first day, 30% the second day, and then 60% the final third day. First 2 days she did good, but the second night around midnight she spiked a fever. We went into the CHOP ER because we weren't comfortable with not being in the hospital at that point. And as soon as we got there, she felt fine, her fever went away, and kind of stayed up all night, and she had popsicles and was doing good in the morning. And Dr. Stephen Grupp came in and said she looks good and feels good, and I think we need to get the rest of this dose in her. And we agreed. We were 100% all for it. And when she got the final dose, though, she had so much cancer in her system, and these cells revved up right away. And there was so much cancer dying all at once that it overwhelmed her system. And then she ended up in a coma on a ventilator breathing for the next 14 days.
And what happened after that?
So during that time, while she was in the coma, the doctors were working around the clock to try to make her a success and give her every chance she could. And they come up with the suggestion to try an arthritis drug on her to turn her symptoms around that had never been used on a cancer patient. And that drug is tocilizumab. And in her system, we found out later that she had over 3 pounds of tumor in her blood. And that was all being killed at once. And this IL-6 protein was out of control in her system, which was giving her really bad side effects, and she was really swelled up, and to the point where they told us they didn't think she could survive the night. But when they gave her that medicine, things started to turn around with her blood pressure right away. And I believe it was 14 days after the coma, she woke up on her 7th birthday. But before that, Dr. Grupp came through the door one day and he said, you know, this is amazing to us, and we're cautiously optimistic, but we see that Emily's improving faster than we expected for how sick she was, and now her B cells are disappearing, so we think it's working. So again, she woke up on her 7th birthday, which was May 2nd of 2012, and then 8 days later, which would be 23 days from her first dose of T cells, they checked her bone marrow, and she was completely cancer-free.
It's quite an amazing story. Dr. Shaw, you do a lot of this work out at NCI, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the these safety aspects of it, and what was going on with Emily. As I understand it, it was some protein called interleukin-6 that was causing the problem, and that Dr. June at Penn suggested the drug, which I can't pronounce the name of, and because his daughter has rheumatoid arthritis and she was on the drug, and that it quieted down the immune system. What have you seen? You said something very interesting to me just a few minutes ago. You said we have learned a lot from Emily Whitehead. What have you learned from Emily Whitehead, both about safety and about other issues?
So one of the main complications of giving CAR cell therapy is a side effect profile called cytokine release syndrome.
Which is what Emily had.
Which is what Emily had, and which is what we see with a lot of patients who are having a response to CAR therapy. I'll refer to it as CRS. But CRS is essentially an inflammatory milieu that arises as the CAR cells go in. The CAR cells go in, they see the leukemia, they expand, and they start to grow in numbers. And as that expansion is happening, there's all of these inflammatory, they're inflammatory cytokines that are then released in the body that are causing a lot of the side effects that Emily had. They can lead to low blood pressure, difficulty breathing, needing to go to the ICU. Some can even lead to some forms of neurotoxicity, which you may have heard about as well. So what we learned from Emily was that they checked her blood to see if there were any of these cytokines that were elevated. IL-6 was amongst one of those cytokines. Tocilizumab is an IL-1/6 receptor blockade, so it actually blocks the ability of IL-6 to affect your organs, and by giving that blockade medication, the IL-6 was no longer causing the problems that it was causing in her body. So as we learn about cytokine release syndrome, as we learn about the effectiveness of CAR therapy, what we learned from Emily was how to be able to deliver this product safely without causing that degree of toxicity. We now have an algorithm that most physicians who are doing CAR cell therapy use to help guide our treatment regimens of when to intervene with tocilizumab to make the therapy safer, when to give steroids if we need to, and when to think about other ways to intervene to make the therapy possible so that they are not in a coma for 14 days and able to have the maximal efficacy without having significant toxicity. That is an area that continues to be explored as we try to make this therapy safer.
It's still a treatment that is quite risky, is it not? I mean, is this not one of the reasons why the FDA and Penn and Novartis and CHOP have all developed a program for it to be used in limited number, 36 or so, maybe fewer, medical centers and administered by doctors who are specially trained. Isn't that right? I assume that you have been training some of the doctors?
Yes. Yes, that is true, that we still feel that because of the side effects that many patients like Emily have had with this therapy, We do know a way to safely manage these patients and get them through it, but it requires a lot of specialized care. And so we all want this to be able to be available to more patients, but we want it to be available safely. And so it's really important that we have specialized centers that are adequately trained and really rigorously trained on how to be able to manage and get patients through this as safely as possible.
How are you doing the training? Are you visiting all these centers and training in person?
There are many sites that have been involved in the trials that led to the FDA approval, who have treated patients already, and so have received a lot of that training. And then there are other sites that are now being added. And we do a lot of interacting with those physicians, both Dr. Grappa and myself, and then as well the team at Novartis who has run these clinical trials do a lot of one-on-one training with those sites.
Dr. Shaw, as you and I have talked about before, one of the challenges of this therapy is that some children do relapse, and Emily was fortunate from that standpoint that she was not one of them. But about 30% of children, is that about the proportion, relapse on this therapy? And you're doing, and I'm sure you're doing also work to try to reduce the relapse rate and trying to figure out different ways to use this technology. What are you doing?
Yeah, so what we hope for CAR cell therapy is that not only will it be effective, but that it'll be durable. And in terms of durability, Emily leads the field with 5 years of being in remission. But not every child who gets CD19 CAR therapy will have that durability of response. Amongst those patients who relapse after CD19 CAR therapy, some of them are now losing the protein, the actual CD19, so the CAR cell therapy becomes ineffective.
It's because the target
is no longer available to be targeted. And there's multiple mechanisms how that may happen. What we've done at the NCI, we have a long history now of looking at CD22 as an alternate target on the leukemia cell. So we have a CAR therapy that targets CD22 that has also been found to be very effective.
Yes, and also tell me a little bit about that trial, a little bit more about that trial, and also about the fact that you're going to move into multiple targets.
Yeah, so in terms of the CD22 CAR therapy, it's very similarly constructed to the CD19 CAR therapy. You have the CD22 that's on your leukemia cell, and the CD22 CAR that then attacks that. With that therapy, we've seen, again, cytokine release syndrome, just as you would with the CD19 CAR, but we've also seen good remissions and have a patient who's out a few years as well. The problem, again, is a problem of relapse. We have patients who are similarly relapsing after losing CD22. So the next trial that we're going to be focusing on is actually a combination therapy of a bispecific CAR that simultaneously will target 19 and 22. And again, the paradigm there is not all that dissimilar from multi-agent chemotherapy. So if you go back to the origins of treatment of childhood ALL, you started with one therapy, and they would maybe have a remission for a few weeks, maybe a few months if you were lucky, but then you would have leukemia resistance. So then you could put into that combination chemotherapy, which is what the current paradigm is of treating childhood ALL. What we're hoping to do with the bispecific CAR is have a CAR that is simultaneously targeting both 19 and 22 so that you don't have this problem of the leukemia then outsmarting the CAR cells that it's getting at an individual level.
And what about you? Are you working on the relapse issue as well?
We are. I think we all feel that while the results that we have seen are remarkable, we always want to do better, and we want to be able to overcome the relapses that we have seen. And so we similarly are going at the leukemia from a different angle by targeting CD22. And we also are looking at the other form of relapse, which is having the T cells not last as long as we would like. The goal behind this therapy is that this can really be a living drug and something that can last in the body for months or years. And that happens in many patients, but in some patients that does not happen and the T cells go away more quickly. And so we're studying ways that we can overcome that and make the T cells slightly differently to see if they can last longer, and also add combinations of medicines to try to get the T cells to last longer.
What about other types of cancers? Would they be treatable with this kind of treatment?
Yeah, I think that's the goal. So right now we started with the B-cell leukemias. We're also working on trying to target lymphomas that are also of B-cell origin. I think for us that's definitely an unmet need. Thinking about using this CAR cell therapy for lymphoma populations where they may not have other therapies, and then also shifting to a different mode of different type of leukemia altogether. So we're working on developing CAR therapies that target AML, which is acute myelogenous leukemia.
And what about the whole idea of solid cancers? Is that something that this therapy, and it's not just Novartis, we should say, there are other companies and other academic researchers all over the country and all over the world who are working very hard on this. Do you know what the state of play is in terms of, when I talked to Dr. June after the approval, he said that in mice studies, the results were that there was a response by a kind of a wide array of cancers. But the big question is, how long would it take? Will it translate to humans, number one? And number two, how long would it take to have that happen?
Well, in theory, this technology could really target any type of cancer. If you could find something specific to the cancer that you could train the T cells to find, this could work across a whole spectrum of cancers. What has become an issue for solid cancers is really getting access to the tumor itself and overcoming some of the mechanisms that the tumor has developed to try to block the immune system. And so what we think will need to happen for this to work in other types of tumors is that there will need to be some additional technology to try to overcome some of those barriers. But certainly the hope is that it can be expanded much more broadly.
Tom, when you wound up at CHOP and in this trial, were they describing it as a way to get Emily better enough to get a bone marrow transplant, or were they saying that it would be hopefully a replacement for the need of a bone marrow transplant?
You know, from our perspective, my wife and I were hoping that it would work and not need a bone marrow transplant, but they did say that it would be our call to make, after the cells would work, depending on how many T cells were inside her. And that if, as parents, if we wanted to go to bone marrow transplant, we could. We personally didn't think Emily was healthy enough to survive a transplant. And we had seen many kids suffer through bone marrow transplants. And I do tell people now, I was more afraid of signing Emily up for the full body radiation to go to bone marrow transplant than I ever was of entering her as the first patient in the CAR T trial. But we were just hopeful that it would work. I always felt inside that it would. And then once it did work, we did have that discussion and said, as far as us as parents, we did not want to go to bone marrow transplant.
And is the idea that it replaces bone marrow transplant? How often do children get bone marrow transplants after they get CAR T?
I think it's too early to say that it'll be a replacement for bone marrow transplant, because I think right now we don't have enough years with CAR cell therapy to know the durability. And currently the standard of the curative treatment for patients with multiply relapsed refractory ALL would be transplant. But we know that patients are going to relapse after transplant as well. So I think what the future holds is either some combination where you're able to use the CAR cells as a bridge to transplant, potentially making the transplant less toxic, if you can get patients into deep remission, or being able to have a way to identify which patients at risk of relapsing from the CD19 or any CAR cell therapy where transplant would be indicated. And I think that's where the future is in terms of where the research really needs to be to make the decision about transplant.
Dr. Maud, we're going to have Emily join us in a minute, but first I wanted to ask you a question. When you're talking to parents about this, this procedure, this very dramatic treatment, what do you tell them? And then what do they tell you after the therapy is over?
So when parents are coming to us, and they are often really looking for hope and looking for an option after, in many cases, having been through many different therapies. And we're very upfront and honest about what to expect, and it can be very scary to hear all of the potential side effects. But we prepare them in a lot of detail and walk them through, and I think what they're relieved to hear are that we have treated many patients and have been able to get them through. And what they come out on the other end is coming back months later with their child back in school, playing baseball, doing things with their friends. And I have had many parents say to me, my child hasn't felt this good in years since before they were first diagnosed.
That must be amazing.
It is.
At this time, I'd love to welcome Emily Whitehead to join us. Please, let's give her a round of applause. Emily, thanks so much. I hope you're having a fun time in Washington. You told me you went to the Air and Space Museum this morning. What was your favorite part of it?
My favorite part, I have to say, was the planetarium.
Yeah. What did you like about it?
It was really cool because it looked real. Like looking at,
Now, your father has told me that you don't remember a lot of the very difficult things that happened to you, and I think that sounds like that's a good thing. But I'm wondering if you remember how silly he was and the extent he went to try to make you smile and laugh through it. Like, is it true that did he really dress up like a Penn State cheerleader? What did he do?
I remember this one time he picked me up by my ankles and he held me upside down and helped me do a handstand on my bed.
Oh my gosh.
Our rule was you had to smile at least once a day. And, as parents, you're putting this poison into your kids to try to get them better, and they're really, just going through hell to try to get better. So we tried to do whatever we could just to try to get a smile once a day. So we would do whatever crazy things we could. And sometimes we would set up the nurses too. We got a large syringe full of water one time, and when Nurse Rob walked through the door, Emily gave it to him with a water shot. I got a remote control helicopter, and I'd fly it around the room, and Emily would hide under the covers. And that was fun up until it got stuck in my wife's hair. So,
she must have loved
made
that.
me take away the helicopter after that.
What
It
about
made
the
Emily
pom-poms?
laugh.
What about the pom-poms? What about the Penn State pom-poms?
All right. It was really funny when he did that.
Luckily, there's no video.
That's right. So, Emily, you're back at school now. You're in 7th grade?
Yes.
And I'm told that you're a completely normal preteen child. Tell me a little bit about now that you feel well, what do you like to do in your free time?
I really like to do any kind of art, and I really like to hang out with my dog, Lucy.
Great. Now, is it true that you're a potter? You took pottery classes this summer?
I did. I took a couple, and I'm taking clay class in school.
And you also like to make videos, right? What kind of videos do you make?
I do. I make videos for YouTube.
What do you? Are they instructional videos, or what kind of videos are they?
There are a bunch of different ones. There are weird videos that I make with my friends to different art things.
Is this where slime is somehow involved in this?
There's a lot of slime.
There's a lot of slime.
Her channel's Ambassador with an E, because we're Emily's ambassadors.
I've seen some of the photos of when you returned home to Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania, from CHOP, and the whole town came out to greet you, and it was It was just amazing. What was that like to experience that? You must remember that because that was a good thing, right?
It was amazing because it was raining and everybody still came outside. And I remember that my nan or his mom handed Lucy through the window.
Oh.
And she was so excited to see me.
I bet she was. Your entire family has really taken it upon yourselves to help other families and other people who are in the same situation, and unfortunately there are probably too many. Do you hear a lot from different people who are struggling with this, different families?
Yeah, so when Emily's treatment was covered in the worldwide media when it was finally announced in December of 2012, we started getting calls immediately from families from all over the world saying, we're being sent home on hospice with our children and we would like help. And that eventually, led us to start our own foundation, the Emily Whitehead Foundation. But it has really increased ever since the ODAC hearing and the FDA approval. It's getting more coverage, and now people trust it more that it has FDA approval, and we hear from a minimum of 1 to 2 patients per week.
Wow.
So we take those calls, every chance we can get and try to help guide other parents to trust their instincts and make the best call for their child.
And Emily, what happens, I'm told your father was telling me that because you have to go to CHOP so much to be checked out, that other children approach you and other parents approach you while you're there. How does that feel? Do you like that? Do you not like that?
I do like that because they come up to me and they tell me that I'm an inspiration to them, and it makes me feel really good.
So you feel as though you're really contributing something, that it actually you're making a difference. And what do you tell kids your age or younger who are dealing with this, who just need a little inspiration, a little hope?
I always tell them never give up and always keep believing in yourself.
Tom, you said also that there are very specific things ideas that you have that you tell parents based on your experience.
Yeah.
And doctors. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, and we try to, now tell doctors to listen to your patients whenever they're asking for some of these new treatments. Not everybody, is up to speed yet on these new breakthroughs. But we also tell the parents that, what we noticed when we were there is these doctors have to take care of every patient in the hospital, and you only have to take care of your child or your patient. So we really encourage people to do research on everything that'll be put into your child and to really trust your instincts. Because if we didn't trust our instincts, and once in a while, maybe say no to what was being recommended that day, Emily wouldn't be with us.
Tell us a little bit about that. Give us an example of how that worked. So there's quite a few different examples, but for instance, when Emily was in the PICU and she was on the ventilator, they came around to do rounds one morning, and my wife, who works in research at Penn State University, kept files of everything of Emily and had it in her computer, especially her blood work. And some of the residents one morning started talking about Emily's blood work and her vitals, and it sounded like things took a turn for the worse and that she needed some immediate care. And my wife, Carrie, was paying attention, and she said, "What you just said is not Emily's blood work. I paid attention, and that can't be what you just said. It's not correct." And they actually looked back at the computer and said, "I apologize, we brought up the wrong patient." Oh boy.
So yeah, and we know, they're working around the clock, and everyone's tired sometimes, and it just helps to be an advocate and stay on top of things.
Well, and that wasn't the only time your wife played a very pivotal role in making decisions. Tell us a little bit about her role. You said she's a researcher at Penn State, is that right?
Yeah, she right now she's working in the military clearinghouse, but she has that kind of training, and she's worked as a project manager in the past on research projects, and she was able to always access her work computer and just research all the different drugs that was being offered to Emily. And another day, Emily had relapsed, and our transplant doctor at Hershey had said, you don't have time for a second opinion, and we're going to start the ICE round of chemotherapy, which is 3 drugs to start with I, C, and E. And it didn't feel right to us that day. And we just said, we're going to go back to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and get another opinion. And they said, she's not stable enough to transfer for another opinion. But we turned it down, and we drove her down there ourselves. And had she been given that drug, we were told now that she would have had no T cells to grow. So turning it down that day saved her life.
That's quite amazing. How many parents would have the confidence in their judgment to do that? I think that would be a very, very difficult thing to do. So the message that you give to parents is to trust their own intuition and do their own research, as well as listening to the doctors, and you tell the doctors to listen to the patients.
Absolutely.
What are the next plans for the foundation?
We have our signature events coming up on October 28th. We're having the Emily Whitehead Foundation Believe Ball at the Valley Forge Casino. And we've invited all the patients that got the treatment after Emily, and we're trying to get as many together as possible for the first time in one place, and bring in a lot of people. The doctors are coming, and the workers, and just have everyone get together and have a night of inspiration and stories. And our goal is to continue raising money and help fund growing the T cells and furthering immunotherapy for the other patients that need it.
Dr. Mon and Dr. Shaw, it's interesting to me, and I think to everyone, that this was maybe the first cancer drug that was approved first for children. Is that right? I think maybe it was. Yes. So that made it really doubly historic. Can you explain a little bit about why that is, and why children traditionally have been the last to get cancer therapies?
Well, it's often the case that drugs are studied first in adults for a couple of reasons. One is that we do want to show that the drugs can be safely given in adults before it is moved into children, and that's a big part of it. But the second reason is that, fortunately, pediatric cancers aren't that common. And so typically, it doesn't make a lot of sense for drug companies to really be developing a drug that's specific to a disease with a very small population of patients. And so this was really amazing that, that this was developed first in children and first approved in children, and is incredible as a pediatrician to know that the research that we were a part of contributed to this, and to know that this is something that is really important and groundbreaking, and that the studies that were done in children made that possible. And I think it's partially because children are strong. Children like Emma are really strong, and being able to study this therapy in children was really what made this therapy advance, because we were able to safely administer this in children.
Dr. Shaw?
Yeah, another part of this is also the medical ethics of children being able to provide consent. And so I think that also comes into play when thinking about doing particularly phase 1 trials that are not intended to look at the efficacy, but are really intended to explore the safety and the toxicity profile of these therapies, which is why there's sort of a scaled down approach. You start with adults who are freely able to give consent before going to pediatric age patients. But as the world evolves and we learn more about targeted therapies, I think, both with the FDA, and I know certainly, even within the pediatric oncology branch, we are looking at identifying protocols where it does make sense to think about lowering the age limit. And so instead of having a strict cutoff at age 18, if there is a targeted therapy and a patient has that target, can you reduce that age limit to start a little bit lower? When we did our our phase 1 CD22 CAR protocol, we were actually able to start at age 16, even though we had to treat adults before children. That's one example of being able to introduce therapies into children a little bit earlier.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. A special thanks to Emily for coming down and meeting with us. And thank you, Mr. Whitehead.
Thanks for having us.
Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to exit, and I'm going to turn over the program to my colleague, Fran Kritz, for the next panel. Thank you.